December 24, 1944. Western Front near Bastogne. Snow falls in heavy, silent sheets over the ruined Ardennes forest. The war is frozen in place. Men crouched in foxholes, rifles clutched, breath turning to ice. The faint echo of artillery fades into a winter stillness too deep for comfort. Among the wreckage of twisted trucks and abandoned helmets, a young German soldier lies wounded, his uniform stiff with blood, his eyes wide with fear. The sound of boots crunching through the snow draws closer. He grips his pistol, trembling. An American medic kneels beside him, his voice calm, his hands steady. No anger, no mockery, only quiet efficiency and warmth as he wraps a bandage around the man's arm. The German's face changes. Confusion, disbelief, then something like shame. All his life, he had been told these men were monsters. Yet here one was, saving him. The snow keeps falling. The medic rises and signals for a stretcher. And in that moment, one soldier's worldview begins to fracture. A silent beginning to the collapse of an empire built on lies. The war for the German mind. Before a single American soldier set foot on European soil, another war had already begun. A silent, invisible war for control of the human mind. From the earliest days of Adolf Hitler's rise to power, the Nazi state understood that propaganda would be its most powerful weapon. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, once declared, "It is not enough to conquer by force. One must also conquer the soul." By 1939, every German household was flooded with carefully crafted lies. Through radios, newspapers, films, and classrooms, the enemy was painted not only as a threat to the nation, but as something less than human. And among all the enemies, none were so twisted in the German imagination as the Americans. Goebbels' ministry portrayed them as a race of criminals and mongrels, a land corrupted by greed, jazz, and racial impurity. In Nazi posters and newsreels, America was not a democracy, but a chaos of mixed blood and moral decay. German soldiers were told that American men fought for money, not honor, that their soldiers would massacre prisoners, that their women were corrupt, that their leaders were puppets of Jews. For young Germans conscripted into the Wehrmacht, these messages were not questioned. They were reality. The radio was their teacher, the film their sermon, the Führer their prophet. By the early years of the war, 1940 to 1942, these beliefs had hardened into certainty. Victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries only confirmed what the regime had promised: that Germany was destined to rule, and the enemies of the Reich were degenerates who could never match the discipline of the Aryan soldier. But propaganda is most effective in triumph. In defeat, it begins to crack. By 1943, the tide had turned. The collapse at Stalingrad sent shockwaves through the German army. Thousands of soldiers, trapped, starving, freezing, began to question what they had been told. The Soviets were not the Untermenschen they had imagined. They fought with courage and ferocity. And if that lie could fall apart, what of the others? Still, Goebbels fought to hold the illusion together. Through every speech and radio broadcast, he turned fear into a weapon. The Americans, he said, were the greatest threat yet. They will destroy your homes, enslave your wives, and poison your children's blood. And so, as Allied bombers darkened the skies over Hamburg and Cologne, the average German soldier carried not just a rifle into battle, but years of implanted hatred. Hatred that justified every order, every killing, every resistance to surrender. When American troops finally landed in North Africa in 1942, then in Italy and later in Normandy, the Nazi propaganda machine worked harder than ever. Leaflets and broadcasts warned that surrendering to the Americans meant torture and humiliation. Officers repeated the same lines to their men: You will not be taken prisoner. You will be shot. And for a time, the lies held. German units fought to the last man rather than surrender. Even wounded soldiers begged to be killed instead of captured. But reality has a way of cutting through illusion. By late 1944, as the front collapsed and tens of thousands of German troops were taken prisoner, the first cracks began to widen. Reports spread quietly through Wehrmacht ranks. Stories whispered by captured comrades who had somehow survived. Stories of American camps with food, blankets, even cigarettes. Stories that didn't fit the image painted by Goebbels's brush. For many German soldiers, it was impossible to believe. The propaganda had been too absolute, too constant. Yet, as more were captured, the impossible would soon become undeniable. And in the freezing winter of 1944, on the battlefields of Belgium and the forests of the Ardennes, thousands would come face to face with the truth, not through bullets, but through an unexpected mercy. When the lies met reality. By mid-1943, the myth of Nazi invincibility was unraveling. The Reich was still strong, but its heartbeat had begun to falter. Allied bombers roared above German cities night after night, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. In the east, the Red Army was pushing westward, relentless and vengeful. In the west, new rumors spread of massive Allied armies gathering in Britain, preparing to strike. Inside this pressure cooker, propaganda became oxygen. Goebbels ordered that every defeat be reframed as a temporary tactical withdrawal. Every bombing was called terrorism, and every Allied soldier, especially the American, was depicted as a sadist. Posters showed caricatures of dark-skinned GIs leering at German women, or cartoonish depictions of greedy Wall Street bankers commanding the U.S. Army. But propaganda thrives only in isolation. Once the front lines broke and men began to see the enemy with their own eyes, the illusion couldn't hold. In North Africa, 1943, the first large numbers of German soldiers were captured by American forces. At first, many expected to be executed. They dropped their weapons trembling, some whispering prayers. Instead, they were disarmed, given water, and treated by medics. At prisoner camps in Tunisia and later in Algeria, Germans received bread, cigarettes, even medical attention, luxuries many had not seen in weeks. The shock spread quickly. When interrogated, some POWs were less hostile than confused. One officer reportedly asked an American intelligence sergeant, "Why do you feed us? We were told you would kill us." For the Americans, this was standard military discipline. The Geneva Convention was not a slogan, but an order. For the Germans, conditioned to see mercy as weakness, it was disorienting. By June 1944, as Allied troops stormed Normandy, tens of thousands more German soldiers found themselves in the same position. In the hedgerows of France and the beaches of Omaha and Utah, surrender became less terrifying. Men began to recall what they'd heard from comrades captured in Italy or Africa. The Americans don't kill prisoners. For the German High Command, this was dangerous. Goebbels's ministry doubled its efforts, spreading fabricated reports of American atrocities to maintain fear. They even circulated stories of entire German units being burned alive after surrendering. Stories that had no evidence but great psychological power. Yet, the truth kept leaking through. Letters from captured soldiers, heavily censored but still human, slipped back into Germany through the Red Cross. One line from a POW's note, intercepted later by Allied intelligence, read simply, "They gave us soup, real soup, and they called me by name, not by number." Such small sentences carried immense weight. As the Battle of Normandy turned into the breakout across France, American field hospitals began treating German wounded alongside their own. Chaplains prayed over both bodies. Nurses, exhausted and sleepless, handed cups of water to men wearing swastikas on their sleeves. For many Germans, this act, a drink of water from the hands of the supposed enemy, struck deeper than any sermon. By autumn 1944, the Wehrmacht was collapsing. The Western Front, stretched thin and desperate, relied on child soldiers, Volkssturm militias, and men pulled from hospitals. Yet even now, the propaganda persisted. Goebbels broadcast warnings that American Negro troops were mutilating civilians. He knew that fear, not truth, was his last weapon. But the fear was losing its bite. German units began surrendering en masse in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. At the same time, U.S. camps in England and the United States filled with hundreds of thousands of POWs. To the astonishment of the German prisoners, many found themselves on farms, allowed to work, paid small wages, and even permitted to write letters home. In one camp in Georgia, a former panzer commander later recalled, "We were treated more decently by our captors than by our own officers in the last months of the war." Each of these experiences was a quiet detonation inside the Nazi narrative. Every letter, every rumor of kindness, every story of decency from the enemy became a blow against the regime's moral authority. By the end of 1944, when the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble, began, thousands of German soldiers marched into battle with minds already divided. They still obeyed orders, still fought fiercely, but somewhere beneath the noise of artillery and snow, a seed of doubt had been planted. That seed would bloom in the frozen forests of Belgium, where the German soldier and the American medic met under the falling snow, and where propaganda would finally face its reckoning. The winter of 1944 was not just a season of battles. It was a season of revelations. In makeshift American field hospitals stretched across Belgium and France, German soldiers lay side by side with men they had been ordered to kill. Some were young, barely 19, faces thin from weeks of hunger. Others were veterans from Poland and Russia, hardened by years of blood. Yet all shared the same disbelief when the bandages were unrolled, the morphine injected, the water offered without a sneer. To these men, it was as if the world had inverted itself. For years, they had been told the Americans were barbaric mercenaries, but the medics who tended to them spoke softly, called them buddy, even smiled. The first taste of American coffee, the first cigarette offered not in triumph but in simple routine, these small acts broke through years of conditioning more effectively than any lecture. German sergeant from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division later wrote in his post-war diary, "We expected beatings. Instead, they gave us soup. I could not understand it. I felt humiliated and grateful at the same time." This emotional dissonance, humiliation mixed with relief, became a common thread among captured Germans. Their ideology had told them mercy was weakness. Their experience proved otherwise. The power of perception. American commanders understood, perhaps more intuitively than systematically, that every act of humanity carried psychological weight. A soldier saved was not just a life spared, it was an enemy disarmed on a deeper level. The Psychological Warfare Division, PWD, of the Allied Command, established in 1943, recognized that leaflets and broadcasts could only go so far. True persuasion came from experience, and nothing spoke louder than being treated humanely by the enemy. Documents from PWD archives describe how American units were instructed to treat prisoners according to strict standards of decency, not merely out of moral duty, but because it served strategic goals. A well-treated prisoner was more likely to cooperate, to talk, to spread truthful accounts among comrades. Captured Germans were often gathered, fed, and interviewed. Many were astonished to see American officers shaking their hands or allowing them to smoke. This was not propaganda. It was policy, and it was profoundly effective. Some prisoners were even encouraged to write letters home describing their treatment, knowing that each word would ripple through the German ranks, corroding Goebbels's lies from within. One report from 1944 noted, "The treatment of prisoners is in itself the most powerful psychological weapon we possess. Every German soldier who eats in an American camp becomes a messenger of truth." This was not sentimentality. It was psychological warfare, executed with discipline, precision, and restraint. Kindness as strategy. In many POW camps, American guards were carefully briefed to maintain professionalism. Abuse or cruelty was forbidden. The reasons were moral, yes, but also practical. The U.S. Army knew that word of mistreatment could validate Nazi propaganda and harden enemy resistance. Instead, the Americans created the opposite effect. They dismantled fear through decency. One striking example occurred after the Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, where tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured. The sheer scale of surrender overwhelmed the Allied forces. Yet even amid chaos, the Americans distributed food, medical supplies, and even mail services for prisoners. It was not compassion in the modern sense. It was disciplined adherence to the idea that civilization itself was on trial. The Germans noticed. One POW later recalled, "They fed us before they fed themselves." It was hyperbole, perhaps, but it revealed a profound shift from hatred to bewildered respect. As these stories spread, the Nazi narrative began to corrode not from external assault, but from within the minds of its own soldiers. The Americans, knowingly or not, had found a weapon stronger than fear. A moral battlefield. The human dimension of this conflict was as strategic as it was emotional. For the Germans, mercy was never part of military doctrine. For the Americans, it became proof of moral superiority. A quiet, deliberate assertion that democracy could fight a total war without becoming totalitarian. And in that moral contrast, many Germans began to sense what they had lost. Not just battles, but their humanity. Every act of decency, a cigarette, a meal, a word of respect, became a small crack in the edifice of Nazi indoctrination. Each gesture said silently, "You were lied to." By the winter of 1944, that truth was spreading faster than leaflets ever could. The battlefield had shifted, no longer only fought with guns and tanks, but with ideas and actions that transcended ideology. And as snow covered the Ardennes, both armies braced for one final confrontation. The last great gamble of the Reich, where the psychological war would meet its bloodiest test. By January 1945, the psychological divide inside the German army had reached a breaking point. Many soldiers no longer knew what to believe. They fought because they were ordered to, not because they still trusted the vision they had once served. Every captured comrade who returned or sent word from an American camp brought stories that didn't match the official version. Some told of hot meals, warm clothing, even music. Others described being treated by American doctors who risked infection to save them. These were not rumors whispered by civilians. They came from men in uniform, veterans who had fought on every front. The Nazi myth of the barbaric American was dying, one prisoner at a time. Inside Berlin, Joseph Goebbels was furious. His ministry's reports noted the growing moral weakness of frontline troops exposed to enemy kindness. To him, mercy was poison. It softened the German will to fight. Propaganda broadcasts warned that the Americans were using false friendship to destroy the fatherland from within. The message was clear. If captured, resist kindness. It is another weapon. But it was already too late. Soldiers who had seen the reality could no longer unsee it. The human mind, once freed from fear, cannot return to blindness. American commanders understood this shift instinctively. They did not need to broadcast their morality. It revealed itself in every action. When Allied units liberated towns, they shared food with starving civilians, including German families. When the 45th Infantry captured hundreds near the Rhine, they separated officers from enlisted men, processed them fairly, and allowed chaplains to offer services in German. To men who had been told democracy was chaos, this discipline felt alien. To men who had been told Americans were animals, it felt impossible. Every small gesture became a message stronger than any leaflet. A GI offering a cigarette to a captured enemy. A guard allowing a prisoner to sit in the sun. A medic calling a German soldier by his rank instead of a slur. These moments became the unspoken language of moral victory. American war correspondent Ernie Pyle wrote that he saw it in their eyes. The confusion of proud men confronted not with vengeance, but with humanity. They did not know how to receive kindness, he said. They had been taught that mercy was a lie. The American approach was not universal perfection. Cruelty existed, mistakes happened, and prejudice was real. But the pattern that mattered most, the general, disciplined respect for the laws of war, became undeniable. And once the truth began to circulate, Nazi propaganda lost its only real weapon: fear. In the final months of the Reich, Goebbels's machine became desperate. Posters screamed warnings that American and British troops would enslave the population. Films portrayed captured soldiers being tortured. But soldiers no longer listened. The disconnect between the propaganda and their lived experience was too vast. The stories returning from the front contradicted everything the regime insisted upon. In some towns, families even prayed for their sons to be captured by the Americans rather than the Soviets. This unspoken hope spread through the Wehrmacht like a quiet rebellion against their own leadership. Soldiers still fought bravely, but not for ideology, only for survival and the men beside them. Historians later found evidence that Allied intelligence units tracked this psychological erosion carefully. Reports from the Psychological Warfare Division noted that prisoners consistently expressed shock and admiration at their treatment. Many volunteered information, not out of fear but out of gratitude. Each interrogation became both an intelligence operation and a moral statement. Every German who returned to his homeland carried the proof that the Nazi worldview had been false. That collapse of faith was perhaps the most decisive unseen victory of the Western Allies. The Americans had not only defeated divisions and regiments, they had shattered an entire narrative of superiority. Goebbels had spent 12 years building a myth of purity and domination. It took a few months of kindness to bring it down. As spring approached and the Rhine crossings began, that realization reached deep into the German psyche. Soldiers who surrendered often did so calmly, even with relief. They no longer feared death at enemy hands. What they feared most was returning to a world that had lied to them so completely. For the Americans, this moral clarity became both a burden and a point of pride. They were exhausted, scarred, and angry from years of fighting, but many understood that restraint was their final weapon. To win militarily was necessary. To win morally was eternal. And so, amid the thunder of artillery and the ruins of cities, the battle for the German mind reached its quiet climax. Not with a gunshot, not with a speech, but with a single act of decency repeated thousands of times. A hand extended instead of a trigger pulled. A blanket offered instead of a blow. In those moments, one truth emerged through the rubble. The strength of an army is not only measured in its firepower, but in its humanity. The snow never seemed to stop. It fell over ruined villages, shattered tanks, and the broken silhouettes of men who no longer knew what they were fighting for. The Battle of the Bulge had begun as Hitler's last desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive meant to split the Allied armies and reclaim momentum. For a moment it worked. The Ardennes forests echoed with German artillery once more, and the old confidence flickered back to life. But beneath that illusion lay exhaustion. The soldiers who marched through those woods in December 1944 were no longer believers. They were survivors. Many of them were young, barely trained conscripts drawn from schools, offices, and bombed-out cities. They carried rifles older than they were, marched without proper boots, and clung to propaganda promises that had long since turned to dust. The High Command called it a counterattack. The men called it suicide. When the American lines held firm, when the skies cleared and Allied aircraft returned, the dream ended in fire. Thousands were trapped in the snowdrifts, surrounded and cut off. The reality of American power became impossible to deny. Convoys of Shermans and half-tracks moved through the white haze like metal phantoms, organized, relentless, unstoppable. Those who were captured expected revenge. What they received instead was warmth. At makeshift collection points outside Bastogne and St. Vith, German prisoners were processed with efficiency, but not cruelty. They were searched, given rations, and sent to field hospitals if wounded. Many had not eaten in days. American soldiers, equally weary, handed them food from their own kits. The silence in those moments was strange. Neither friendship nor hostility, just quiet recognition that the war had taken enough from both sides. A medic from the 101st Airborne later wrote in his journal that one prisoner cried after receiving a cigarette. He just stared at it, as if it was gold, he noted. Then he said in broken English, "You good men." I didn't know what to say. Scenes like that played out across the Ardennes. German officers, stripped of command and illusion, watched their captors behave with an orderliness that made the propaganda films back home seem childish. No looting, no executions, no jeering parades, just the cold routine of a professional army doing its job. It was mercy without theater, and that made it even more powerful. One American colonel described the moment as the victory of civilization over chaos. His words were simple, but they captured what historians would later recognize as a deeper triumph: the collapse of the Nazi moral universe. For the captured Germans, the experience was both humiliating and redemptive. Some could not meet their captors' eyes. Others spoke openly, trying to explain themselves. "We believed everything," one lieutenant said during interrogation. "We thought you were animals. Now I see we were the ones without souls." In the ruined forest villages, American and German wounded often shared the same barns converted into aid stations. Nurses moved from bed to bed, tending to whoever groaned loudest, regardless of uniform. A correspondent who visited one of these makeshift hospitals described it as a strange theater of war, where mercy had taken command. The effect spread quickly. Prisoners transported to rear camps carried stories of unexpected decency. Rumors circulated that the Americans even allowed Christmas services for prisoners, providing candles and hymn books. Whether true or not, the belief itself weakened the propaganda still being broadcast into the trenches. Soldiers began to question who the real savages were: the men who treated them as humans, or the leaders who sent them to die for a fantasy. As January turned to February, the snow began to melt, revealing the cost of the failed offensive. The German army had lost more than 100,000 men in a few weeks, killed, wounded, or captured. What was left of its fighting spirit was buried with them in the ice. Yet the American lines held not only through strength, but through restraint. The moral contrast between the two armies had become impossible to ignore. When the first groups of captured Germans reached the transit camps in France, they found order and structure instead of vengeance. Barracks were clean. Food was rationed fairly. Guards were strict but not violent. The prisoners were even allowed to write letters, though heavily censored. Still, one common phrase appeared again and again: "They treat us better than our own officers did." That single sentence, repeated across thousands of envelopes, did more damage to the Reich than any bombing raid. It destroyed the last illusion of moral superiority that Nazism depended upon. It replaced fear with shame, and shame with reflection. The Battle of the Bulge had been meant to restore German pride. Instead, it ended as the moment the average German soldier saw the truth. His enemies were not monsters. His leaders were liars. And the empire that had promised glory could no longer even protect its own wounded. The snow kept falling over the graves in Ardennes, covering friend and foe alike. For the Americans, it was a hard-won victory, bought with immense sacrifice. For the Germans, it was something else entirely. A revelation born not from speeches or defeat alone, but from the quiet, unyielding force of decency. And as the prisoners were marched toward the camps, past fields of broken armor and frozen corpses, they carried with them the final crack in the wall of Nazi belief. A truth had entered their minds that could not be erased. The propaganda had shouted for 12 years. A single act of humanity had silenced it forever. The night deepened over the Ardennes as the snow thickened into a curtain between life and death. In the shattered forests, where the Battle of the Bulge raged in desperate fury, a quiet transformation was taking place, one that no bullet or bomb could stop. German soldiers who had surrendered under fire were being herded to makeshift American camps. They expected brutality. They expected humiliation. Instead, they found coffee, blankets, cigarettes offered by the very men they had been told were animals. At first, disbelief coated their silence. Prisoners whispered among themselves in the dim light of oil lamps, trying to explain away the impossible. "It's propaganda," one muttered. "They want something." But as the hours turned to days, the pattern did not break. Every wound was treated, every body buried with dignity. The Americans who stood guard did not taunt them. They spoke of home, of baseball, of mothers and wives waiting for them to return alive. The lies they had carried from their youth began to loosen their grip. Nazi indoctrination had been complete. From school classrooms to Hitler youth rallies, they were told Americans were mongrels, decadent, cruel, subhuman. The Führer's speeches had painted them as destroyers of civilization. Yet here they were, offering soup to shivering prisoners who had tried to kill them hours before. The mind struggled to reconcile it. Some broke down quietly, weeping into their blankets. Others stared at their captors with hollow eyes, unsure what to believe anymore. Among the German units, the Waffen-SS had been the most devoted to the ideology. They were the believers, the ones who swore to fight to the last man. But even among them, doubt began to creep in. At one American field hospital, an SS sergeant with a mangled leg was carried in beside an Allied soldier with a similar wound. The medics treated them both side by side, without hesitation. When the German woke, he watched the American nurse adjust the other man's bandage first, then his own. The care was identical. Something inside him cracked. Later, he would whisper to a comrade, "Everything they told us is a lie." The effect of that realization was not immediate, but it spread like thawing ice through the German ranks. In letters intercepted by Allied intelligence, the tone shifted from loyalty to despair. One prisoner wrote, "They told us America was the land of beasts, but the beasts are not here. The beasts were with us." Those words, smuggled through censors, revealed a psychological turning point far more devastating than any battlefield defeat. By late 1944, as Hitler's empire began to crumble, the power of Nazi propaganda relied on isolation. As long as Germans only heard the voice of the Reich, the illusion survived. But the moment they met their enemies face to face, reality shattered the myth. American kindness, unexpected, undeserved, became a weapon far stronger than artillery. It destroyed not bodies, but belief. In one captured town near Hurtgen Forest, A group of German civilians emerged from their basements after hearing American voices outside. They hesitated, terrified of what the propaganda had promised: rape, revenge, annihilation. Instead, they saw soldiers handing chocolate to children. A young girl, no older than 6, reached out with shaking hands. When the soldier smiled and placed the bar in her palm, she burst into tears. Her mother followed, sobbing uncontrollably. Witnesses later said that moment spread through the town like a shockwave. People came out of hiding, weeping, because the nightmare stories had fallen apart before their eyes. The Nazi system depended on fear, the fear of the other. But once that fear dissolved, the whole structure of belief began to rot from within. Soldiers still fought, but the conviction was gone. Reports from the front lines spoke of units surrendering more readily, even protecting captured Americans from SS officers. Some German prisoners volunteered to help dig graves for both sides, saying it was the least a human could do. The propaganda that had painted Americans as devils could not survive the proof of their humanity. In Berlin, Goebbels was furious. His propaganda ministry scrambled to counter the growing reports from captured soldiers. New broadcasts claimed the Americans were tricking prisoners for intelligence, that their mercy was a mask. But the more the regime shouted, the weaker it sounded. German families began to whisper their doubts in kitchens and shelters. If the Americans were truly monsters, why were so many prisoners writing home alive? Why were the wounded being returned, well-fed, with stories of being treated decently? For the first time since 1933, the narrative was slipping out of Nazi control. The power of terror was giving way to the quiet, disarming force of compassion. In the chaos of retreat, as Allied forces closed in from both west and east, many Germans began surrendering not out of fear, but out of a strange, almost hopeful exhaustion. They no longer wanted to fight for a lie. Kindness had done what bombs could not. It had reached the human core buried beneath years of indoctrination. It had shown men that the enemy they were taught to hate still saw them as men. In the forests of the Ardennes, on snowy roads lined with burning tanks, the moral victory had already begun. And yet, for those trapped in Hitler's bunker, and for the zealots still fighting in the ruins of Berlin, this revelation came too late. The war machine had no mercy left to give. But in the frozen fields where ordinary soldiers met ordinary compassion, the myth of the Nazi world was already dead. Its collapse not marked by an explosion, but by a single human act of kindness that no amount of propaganda could erase. The quiet spread of that truth would soon ripple through camps, villages, and captured divisions alike, altering the final months of the war and reshaping how the defeated world would see its conquerors. In the last months of the war, Germany was collapsing not just under Allied firepower, but under the weight of its own disillusionment. What had begun as a trickle of disbelief among captured soldiers became a tide of quiet awakening spreading through the ranks and the homeland. In makeshift POW camps stretching from Normandy to the Rhine, men who once marched beneath swastikas now sat around American stoves, sharing stories of home, watching the illusion of the Reich dissolve with every warm meal. American guards observed it with cautious curiosity. They had been trained to see the enemy as fierce and unyielding, yet what they saw were young boys, thin, frightened, barely more than teenagers. Some spoke halting English, others tried to apologize without words. In return, American soldiers who had lost friends on the front lines found themselves caught between grief and pity. The hatred that had fueled the fight began to melt into something quieter: understanding. The ripple spread beyond the fences. Word of this unexpected humanity filtered back to Germany through letters and captured broadcasts. Civilians listening to illegal radios heard reports of their sons being treated well by the enemy. Mothers, who had been told that surrender meant torture and death, began to hope. This hope was dangerous. It weakened the regime's grip. When people no longer feared the enemy, the entire foundation of totalitarian control began to crack. By March 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and British troops advanced through the north, the shift was unmistakable. Entire German units surrendered without a fight. In one case near Remagen, an entire battalion waved white sheets as the Americans approached, shouting that they no longer wished to fight for Hitler. They expected scorn or execution. Instead, they were given water, medical care, and food. The propaganda that had painted the Allies as barbaric invaders could not survive such encounters. Inside Germany, this transformation was mirrored by scenes of quiet defiance. Civilians, once terrified of Allied troops, began to hide from the Gestapo instead. They sought out American patrols, not to resist, but to surrender. For the first time, defeat did not feel like damnation. It felt like release. American kindness, often spontaneous and individual, had become a force of moral conquest. It conquered minds before cities. Meanwhile, in the upper echelons of the Nazi hierarchy, the collapse of belief was visible in the faces of officers. Captured generals who had once parroted Hitler's rhetoric now admitted in interrogations that the propaganda had gone too far. One confessed, "We created monsters out of men we never knew." The statement, recorded in Allied archives, symbolized the crumbling myth of Nazi moral superiority. As the Allies liberated concentration camps, the contrast between Nazi cruelty and Allied restraint became unbearable to many Germans. At Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen, the scale of horror was revealed to the world. For German POWs hearing these reports, the guilt was overwhelming. The same Americans who uncovered these atrocities still treated their captives with fairness. It was not revenge they sought, but truth. That contrast struck harder than any punishment could. In towns along the Elbe, villagers emerged from cellars to find American convoys passing through. The soldiers handed out food to the starving, helped rebuild bridges, and set up hospitals. Children followed them, wide-eyed, learning their first English words: chocolate, freedom, peace. The fear that Nazi propaganda had built for 12 years evaporated in a matter of days. Even German officers began to admit that the moral collapse of the Reich had come from within. Field reports written by the Wehrmacht's own intelligence units described growing confusion among troops. One noted, "They no longer believe the enemy is evil. They only believe the war is lost." Yet what those reports failed to capture was the deeper truth. That for many, the loss was not just military, it was ideological. The Americans did not plan this psychological offensive. It was not part of an organized campaign. It happened through instinct, through the simple human refusal to mirror the hatred they faced. Every act of mercy chipped away at the image Goebbels had spent years constructing. Every cigarette, every shared meal, every act of decency became a counterstroke against tyranny. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, the physical destruction was immense, but the moral one was already complete. The Germans who survived understood something their leaders never did: that kindness, not cruelty, had the power to win hearts. That realization reshaped how the defeated viewed the victors. In the ruins of cities and the ashes of belief, they began to rebuild not just homes, but a new idea of what humanity could be. This unplanned victory of compassion would echo far beyond 1945. It would shape how post-war Germany accepted democracy, how it aligned with the West, and how it redefined honor not through obedience, but through conscience. The soldiers who had once seen Americans as monsters now wrote letters decades later, thanking them for saving not just their lives, but their humanity. The war for Europe had ended with explosions, but the war for the German soul had ended in silence. In the quiet moment when a wounded soldier realized his enemy had chosen mercy over vengeance. That realization, passed from man to man, town to town, did what no gun could do. It ended belief in the lie. And from that silence, history began to heal. The guns of Europe had finally gone silent, but the echoes of war lingered in every shattered street and broken soul. The spring of 1945 brought more than surrender. It brought the reckoning of truth. Across Germany, millions of prisoners of war sat in camps that stretched from France to the American Midwest. They waited for their fates, uncertain of what the victors would do with them. Yet what came next surprised even the most hardened veterans of the Reich. In the American-controlled zones, the policy toward German POWs reflected a deliberate choice: justice without vengeance. The United States had seen what hatred could do to a nation. Its officers understood that humiliation would only plant the seeds of another war. So instead of starvation or torture, there was structure: clean barracks, fair rations, and work programs. Captives were made to labor, but they were also allowed to read, to write, and to receive mail from home. In many camps, chaplains organized discussions, offering Bibles, sometimes even philosophy books. For men who had been raised in a world of lies, it was like stepping into light after a long tunnel. The shock of humane treatment became a quiet education. German officers who had expected hatred began to talk with their captors, not as conqueror and conquered, but as soldiers trying to understand how it all went wrong. In one American camp in Texas, a young Wehrmacht lieutenant later recalled how a guard lent him a copy of the U.S. Constitution. He told me, "If you want to know what freedom means, read this." That small act would stay with him for life. When he returned to Germany years later, he became one of the founding figures of its new democratic police force. American kindness in captivity was not born from naivety. It was a calculated moral decision. President Truman and General Eisenhower understood the stakes. The world had seen how the Treaty of Versailles had humiliated Germany after World War I, creating bitterness that fed the rise of Hitler. This time, the victors would not repeat that mistake. The enemy would be defeated, but not dehumanized. Reconstruction began not just with bricks and food shipments, but with respect. The Red Cross recorded the difference. Reports from 1946 noted that the mortality rate in American POW camps was among the lowest in history. German soldiers were given medical care that rivaled that of their guards. Even the Geneva Convention was applied more thoroughly than wartime chaos could have guaranteed. In contrast, Soviet camps were grim reminders of revenge. Thousands died in mines and forests, frozen and forgotten. The German soldiers who returned from the West carried different memories of decency, of shared humanity. Those memories became the seed of post-war change. When West Germany began to rebuild under Allied supervision, the men who had once worn field gray uniforms were now shaping a new republic. They carried stories of how the Americans treated them, not with hatred, but with dignity. In village after village, they told civilians that the enemy had shown mercy. That simple truth became the foundation of reconciliation. The propaganda of the Third Reich could not survive in a world where its victims had chosen compassion. By 1947, the American occupation had shifted from control to cooperation. Programs like the Marshall Plan poured food, machinery, and hope into a land still haunted by rubble and shame. Former soldiers found work rebuilding the same factories they once used for war. The transformation was slow, painful, and imperfect, but it was real. American officers often worked side by side with German mayors, engineers, and teachers, not as masters, but as partners. The moral high ground, once invisible amid the smoke of battle, now guided the reconstruction of an entire nation. The German people began to see the United States not as an occupier, but as an example. School children learned English, communities rebuilt cinemas, jazz and Coca-Cola replaced fear and ration lines. The kindness shown in war had become a bridge to peace. What had begun with one medic bandaging a wounded enemy now rippled through generations. The former prisoners who returned home often spoke softly of what they had seen in the camps. They described the order, the fairness, the strange absence of hate. For many families, these testimonies were the first cracks in the wall of Nazi myth that had lingered even after defeat. Parents who had believed Hitler's promises now heard their sons say, "The Americans are not monsters. They are men like us." That simple statement did more to rebuild faith in humanity than any speech or treaty ever could. And as West Germany began to rise from the ashes, its leaders quietly admitted a truth that history would record: that the mercy of the victors had done more to civilize the defeated than punishment ever could. The war had destroyed cities, but kindness had rebuilt souls. The snow that once fell over the Ardennes has long melted into the soil of memory, but the truth born there endures. Wars are often measured in numbers, in casualties, in cities lost and won. Yet what truly defines them are the choices made when power stands over weakness. In those frozen forests of 1944, when an American medic chose to save the life of his enemy, a different kind of victory began. That single act, repeated countless times across battlefields and prison camps, revealed something deeper than strategy or firepower. It showed that even in the heart of war, humanity could survive its own darkness. The Nazi regime had built its empire on lies, on the belief that mercy was weakness, that compassion was betrayal. But when those lies met the quiet decency of ordinary men, they collapsed without a fight. The kindness that defeated propaganda did not come from orders or politics. It came from individuals: soldiers who shared food with prisoners, nurses who treated wounded enemies, officers who refused to humiliate the defeated. They proved that moral strength can shape history as surely as armies can. In the years that followed, the echoes of those moments reshaped nations. The same Germany that once swore allegiance to hate became a democracy built on conscience. The same America that had waged total war became the architect of peace. Together, they stood as proof that mercy, once given, has the power to rebuild the world it saves. And so, when we remember the war, the battles, the bombs, the endless graves, we must also remember the quieter victories, the moments when one human being looked at another, stripped of uniform and ideology, and chose empathy over vengeance. For in those moments, history changed its course, not through conquest, but through kindness.